On a cold November morning in 2022, Emma Clark, a 27-year-old theology researcher from Cambridge University, stood in the musty attic of Weatherby Hall with raindrops pattering against the century-old windows. The grand estate, once the summer residence of the illustrious Weatherby family, had been donated to the National Trust following the passing of Lord Reginald Weatherby, the last direct male heir of the lineage. Emma had been granted special permission to examine the religious artifacts and documents stored in the mansion as part of her doctoral research on Anglican church history in rural England. The morning light filtered weakly through dust-covered windows as she moved carefully between stacked furniture and sealed boxes, her breath visible in the unheated space. In the far corner, partially hidden beneath a faded tapestry, she noticed an unusual steamer trunk with ornate brass fittings bearing the Weatherby family crest, a falcon clutching an olive branch. The trunk was secured with a heavy padlock that had corroded with age, the key long lost to time. The estate caretaker, an elderly man named George Harmon, helped Emma pry it open with tools from the gardening shed, the metal giving way with a haunting groan. Inside, nestled among silk linings now brittle with age, lay dozens of leather-bound journals, official church correspondence on yellowed stationery, and neatly bundled letters tied with faded ribbons. A small notebook on top caught her attention immediately, its cover embossed with the insignia of St. Dominic's Parish Home, an orphanage that had operated in the nearby village of Blackmere until its closure in the late 1960s. Emma opened the notebook with gloved hands, and a newspaper clipping slipped out, landing on the dusty floorboards. The Blackmere County Herald, dated June 12, 1962, carried a small article at the bottom of its front page. "Local child missing, second disappearance this month from St. Dominic's home," the headline read. "Authorities suspect runaways. Weatherby Foundation offers assistance in search." As Emma began to read through the documents, her academic curiosity quickly transformed into growing horror. These were not merely administrative records, but something far more disturbing, a meticulous chronicle of what appeared to be systematic disappearances cloaked in religious terminology. In one letter dated March 1959, Lady Victoria Weatherby wrote to Bishop James Harrington regarding what she called the sacred duty of purification. The children at St. Dominic's require proper guidance to cleanse their bloodlines of immoral tendencies, she wrote. Our family shall continue to provide financial support for the special procedures as discussed during your visit to the estate. Emma felt a chill that had nothing to do with the attic temperature. If you are intrigued by hidden truths like this, there is much more to discover in this dark chapter of local history. St. Dominic's Parish Home stood for nearly 100 years on the outskirts of Blackmere Village, its Victorian Gothic architecture looming over the rolling countryside like a watchful guardian. Founded in 1873 through the generous patronage of the First Lord Weatherby, the institution was initially celebrated as a beacon of Christian charity in a region plagued by industrial poverty and high rates of orphaned children. The main building was constructed of dark limestone quarried from Weatherby-owned lands, its facade adorned with imposing gargoyles and religious statuary that local children claimed would watch passers-by with stone eyes. A private chapel occupied the east wing, its stained glass windows depicting biblical scenes of divine judgment and salvation, commissioned specially by the Weatherby family and manufactured in their glassworks factory. The orphanage operated under the official oversight of the Church of England, though historical records indicate unusual autonomy granted through special dispensation from the Archbishop of Canterbury, secured through the Weatherbys' considerable influence in both religious and political circles. Father Thomas Blackwood served as the director of St. Dominic's from 1952 until 1963, a stern clergyman known for his unflinching commitment to religious discipline and moral reformation. In parish records, He was frequently praised by church authorities for maintaining exemplary order among the children in his care despite limited resources and overcrowding. Sister Agnes Moore served as matron, overseeing the daily operations and education of the girls, while Brother Michael Collins supervised the boys' dormitories and vocational training. Both answered directly to Father Blackwood, who in turn maintained monthly correspondence with both the diocese and the Weatherby Foundation. The orphanage typically housed between 40 and 60 children at any given time, ranging from infants to 16-year-olds, most surrendered by impoverished families or truly orphaned during the post-war years. Local memory of the institution remains complicated, with some former residents recalling strict but fair treatment, while others speak of harsh discipline and an atmosphere of constant religious scrutiny. The Weatherby family maintained a curiously intimate involvement with St. Dominic's throughout its operation. Lord Edward Weatherby, grandson of the founder and master of the estate during the 1950s, served as chairman of the orphanage's Board of Governors. Despite having no formal background in childcare or education, his wife, Lady Victoria, a woman of austere religious conviction, made weekly visits to the orphanage, often accompanied by her personal chaplain, Father Gregory Winters, who had no official affiliation with the diocese but held significant influence within the institution. The Weatherby Children's Mercy Fund provided nearly 70% of St. Dominic's operating budget, a financial dependence that granted the family extraordinary power over institutional policies and practices. Quarterly reports were delivered directly to Weatherby Hall, containing not only financial summaries but detailed assessments of individual children, including behavioral reports, religious progress, and peculiarly extensive family background information spanning multiple generations. The first recorded disappearance occurred on January 23, 1959, when 8-year-old Thomas Collins, a child with no known relatives, was noted in the orphanage logs as transferred to Special Care Facility. Authorization, Weatherby Foundation. No further details were provided, and no transfer paperwork was filed with local authorities. In the weeks prior, Sister Agnes had documented the boy's increasingly troublesome behavior, noting his resistance to religious instruction and what she termed potential moral corruption stemming from his mother's rumored promiscuity. A similar pattern emerged over the following months as 3 more children, all between the ages of 7 and 10, vanished from institutional records, each disappearance preceded by notations of concerning behavior or questionable bloodlines. By December 1959, the number had grown to 5, yet no alarm was raised, no police reports filed. When Mrs. Sarah Jenkins, a local shopkeeper, inquired about her young niece, who had been placed at St. Dominic's following her parents' fatal automobile accident, she was informed that the girl had been selected for a special adoption program for particularly gifted children, overseen personally by Lady Victoria Weatherby. Mrs. Jenkins was politely but firmly denied any further information regarding her niece's whereabouts. Within the orphanage, a subtle atmosphere of fear began to take hold. Children whispered about midnight summons to the chapel, about classmates who never returned from private counseling with Father Blackwood, about strange sounds echoing from the basement beneath the east wing where the chapel stood. Older children learned quickly to display enthusiastic devotion during religious services, to recite prayers with perfect accuracy, to confess even the smallest infractions before they could be reported by others. Staff members who raised questions about the special transfers were swiftly reassigned to distant parishes or dismissed for moral failings that suddenly came to light. When junior nurse Mary Wilson expressed concern about a missing 7-year-old girl to the visiting parish doctor, she was terminated the following day for alleged theft of medical supplies, a charge she vehemently denied but could not disprove against the word of Sister Agnes. The pattern of disappearances accelerated in 1960 and 1961, with 3 children vanishing in each year, all classified under various administrative euphemisms, emergency relocation, special treatment program, or selected for private sponsorship. Local authorities, when rarely questioned, deferred to the impeccable reputation of the Weatherby family and the church. Police Constable William Parker, whose jurisdiction included Blackmere Village, maintained a close friendship with Lord Edward Weatherby, frequently joining the nobleman on hunting expeditions and receiving generous donations for the Police Benevolent Fund. Documents later recovered from the County Records Office show that any official inquiries were quickly redirected to church authorities, who provided form letters explaining that all transfers had been conducted with proper ecclesiastical oversight and were protected by confidentiality, protocols established for the children's welfare. By early 1962, another child had disappeared, bringing the total to 12 in just over 3 years. The vanishings might have continued indefinitely had it not been for the arrival of Father Daniel Morrison, a young priest assigned to assist the aging Father Blackwood. Educated in more progressive seminaries and less beholden to aristocratic influence, Father Morrison began asking uncomfortable questions about the special program and requesting documentation that Sister Agnes insisted had been sent to diocesan archives. His concerns grew when he discovered that the basement chapel area was kept perpetually locked, with only Father Blackwood, Sister Agnes, and the visiting Father Winters having access. When Father Morrison took his questions directly to Bishop Harrington during a pastoral visit, he was swiftly reassigned to a remote parish in Scotland, his departure so sudden that he was unable to say goodbye to the children or collect all his personal belongings. The whispers about St. Dominic's spread beyond its limestone walls, seeping into the consciousness of Blackmere Village like a slow poison. Parents began to hesitate before surrendering children to the orphanage, despite desperate circumstances. Local families who had traditionally provided seasonal employment to the older orphans began to find reasons to hire from elsewhere. The editor of the Blackmere County Herald, Douglas Matthews, received anonymous letters suggesting improprieties at the institution, though he dared not publish them without concrete evidence, particularly given the Weatherby family's controlling interest in the newspaper. The final disappearance occurred in November 1962, when 10-year-old Elizabeth Foster, a girl whose mother had passed away in childbirth and whose father had abandoned her, was recorded as transferred to a special healing retreat in preparation for adoption by a prominent family. No one saw Elizabeth again, and within 6 months, amid growing rumors and declining admissions, St. Dominic's parish home was closed due to financial constraints, its remaining children dispersed to other institutions across the country. For decades, the truth remained buried, the missing children gradually forgotten as witnesses passed away. Records were sealed in church archives or simply disappeared. The Weatherby family continued its philanthropic activities, though noticeably shifted toward funding hospital wings, university scholarships, and arts patronage, rather than child care institutions. The St. Dominic's building itself was eventually demolished in 1979 to make way for a housing development, erasing the physical reminder of what had occurred within its walls. Lady Victoria Weatherby passed away in 1983, leaving behind a legacy as a devoted churchwoman and generous benefactor to religious causes. Her husband, Lord Edward, followed in 1990 his obituary in the Times, praising his lifelong dedication to improving the lives of disadvantaged children. Their son, Reginald, inherited the title and estate, though he spent much of his time abroad and rarely participated in local affairs, leading to a gradual disconnection between the Weatherby family and Blackmere community. The truth might have remained buried forever had it not been for a series of coincidences and persistent individuals unwilling to let the past fade entirely. In 2010, Dorothy Winters, an elderly woman dying of cancer in a Leeds nursing home, summoned a solicitor to record her final confession. As the illegitimate daughter of Father Gregory Winters and a housemaid at Weatherby Hall, she had grown up in the shadow of her father's secret clerical career and had occasionally accompanied him, disguised as a junior novitiate, to St. Dominic's. What she witnessed there haunted her for decades. Children subjected to extended periods of isolation in the basement chapel areas, ritual fasting that bordered on starvation, and strange ceremonies she described as attempts to cleanse the soul through physical mortification. Though her testimony was detailed, the solicitor, uncertain of its veracity given her deteriorating mental state, merely filed the document rather than pursuing an investigation. The statement remained in legal archives, unexamined and unknown for another 12 years. In 2017, construction workers excavating for a swimming pool in what had once been the gardens of St. Dominic's discovered human remains, small bones that preliminary examination suggested belonged to a child between 8 and 10 years of age. Local police conducted a cursory investigation, concluding that the remains likely predated the orphanage, perhaps belonging to an old parish cemetery that had been improperly documented. Without resources for extensive forensic analysis and with development pressures mounting, the bones were respectfully reinterred in the village churchyard with minimal ceremony. Marcus Elliott, a junior reporter for the regional newspaper who attended the reinterment, noted the conspicuous absence of any Weatherby family representative despite their historical connection to the site. His subsequent request to examine historical records related to St. Dominic's was denied by both church authorities and the county archives, citing privacy regulations and incomplete preservation of documents from that era. Professor James Harrington, a historian at Durham University specializing in the relationship between the Anglican Church and social welfare institutions, began researching the Weatherby family patronage in 2020 as part of a broader academic study. His interest was primarily in philanthropic models rather than potential misconduct, but he found himself repeatedly encountering bureaucratic obstacles when requesting specific records about St. Dominic's. Church archives contained suspicious gaps, county social service records were mysteriously incomplete, and even the normally comprehensive Weatherby Foundation annual reports omitted detailed information about their involvement with the orphanage during the critical years. The historian noted these discrepancies in a scholarly article published in a specialized academic journal, speculating that the records management might reflect the administrative chaos of an underfunded institution rather than deliberate concealment. Few outside academic circles noted his observations, and those who did lacked the authority or resources to investigate further. Everything changed when Emma Clark discovered the hidden trunk in Weatherby Hall in 2022. As a doctoral student with an academic interest in religious institutions, she initially approached the documents with scholarly detachment. But the human tragedy documented in the meticulously preserved letters quickly transformed her research into a moral imperative. The trunk contained not only administrative correspondence, but private journals, including one kept by Lady Victoria Weatherby herself, in which she outlined in disturbing detail her theological justification for what she termed spiritual purification of tainted bloodlines. If certain children carry the moral weaknesses of their forebears, she wrote, is it not our Christian duty to subject them to trials that might purify their souls? Even if their physical bodies cannot withstand the process, the legacy of their cleansed spirits surely compensates for any temporary suffering. Most damning were the detailed logs maintained by Father Blackwood recording each child selected for the special program, the justification for their selection, and clinical observations of their responses to the purification process. Children of unwed mothers, those with parents who had criminal records or moral failings, and those displaying what was termed resistant temperament toward religious authority, were most frequently targeted. The log documented days or sometimes weeks of isolation in the basement chambers, restricted food and water described as spiritual fasting, forced prayer sessions lasting up to 12 hours, and what was euphemistically called physical mortification to encourage spiritual awakening. The final entry for each child simply noted, purification complete or transferred to final care, with no indication of where they were taken afterward or whether they had survived the ordeal. Accompanying financial records showed substantial payments from the Weatherby Foundation to church officials, including Bishop Harrington, classified as special discretionary funds for spiritual development. Emma was torn between academic protocol and moral outrage, uncertain whether to process the documents through proper archival channels or take them directly to authorities. After sleepless nights wrestling with her conscience, she approached Dr. Catherine Reynolds, her faculty advisor, who immediately recognized the historical and legal significance of the discovery. Together they contacted both the police and Elizabeth Montgomery, an investigative journalist known for her work uncovering historical institutional abuse. As news of the discovery spread, church officials attempted to claim ownership of the documents, arguing they constituted protected ecclesiastical communications, while the Weatherby Foundation issued statements questioning the authenticity of the materials and suggesting they might be forgeries planted to damage the family's reputation. The truth, however, was now impossible to contain. Elizabeth Montgomery published a detailed exposé in The Guardian, including photographs of key documents and interviews with elderly locals who remembered the orphanage and the missing children. The story spread quickly across national media, prompting the Archbishop of Canterbury to announce a formal church investigation into the historical allegations. Police established a special task force to determine whether criminal charges could still be pursued against any surviving participants. The most dramatic development came when ground-penetrating radar was employed at the former St. Dominic's site, revealing disturbing anomalies in the soil beneath what had been the chapel area. When excavation began in April 2023, the full horror was finally unearthed. 12 small skeletons buried in unmarked graves, each showing signs of malnourishment and, in several cases, evidence of physical trauma. Lord Charles Weatherby, great-nephew of Lord Edward and current head of the family, held a press conference vehemently denying any knowledge of his ancestors' actions, though financial records clearly showed the continued transfer of hush money to church pension funds well into the 1990s. He publicly distanced the current Weatherby Foundation from its historical counterpart, announcing the establishment of a victims' compensation fund and a memorial scholarship for disadvantaged children. Few were convinced by this belated display of conscience, particularly when emails leaked showing his private attempts to suppress the investigation and discredit Emma Clark. The family that had once been synonymous with nobility and philanthropic virtue now found itself associated with one of the most disturbing cases of institutional abuse in modern British history. The Anglican Church faced its own reckoning, forced to acknowledge decades of complicity and cover up at the highest levels. Internal documents revealed that complaints about St. Dominic's had reached diocesan authorities multiple times, but were consistently suppressed to protect both the church reputation and its relationship with wealthy benefactors. Bishop Michael Lawrence, the current bishop of the diocese, issued a formal apology, acknowledging that the church had prioritized power and financial security over the welfare of the most vulnerable in its care. A comprehensive review of all church-affiliated child care institutions was announced, along with the establishment of an independent commission to examine historical cases of abuse and ensure proper accountability. For many, these measures came far too late, mere gestures that could never compensate for lives destroyed and justice delayed for more than 60 years. As the investigation deepened, researchers uncovered the disturbing ideological foundations of the purification program. Lady Victoria Weatherby, it emerged, had been deeply influenced by eugenics theories popular among the upper classes in the early 20th century, combined with fringe theological concepts about spiritual heredity and divine bloodlines. Her personal library, still preserved at Weatherby Hall, contained numerous volumes on racial theory, hereditary moral traits, and obscure religious texts, suggesting that certain bloodlines were inherently corrupt and required intervention to prevent spiritual contamination. These pseudo-scientific ideas had found fertile ground in the mind of Father Gregory Winters, whose theological training had been minimal and whose position had been secured primarily through Weatherby patronage. Together they had developed an elaborate justification for identifying and purifying children they deemed spiritually compromised by their ancestry. The basement chambers revealed during the excavation confirmed the worst aspects of Dorothy Winters' testimony. Small cells, barely large enough for a child to lie down, had been constructed beneath the chapel floor, accessible only through a hidden door behind the altar. Prayer instructions were carved into the stone walls, alongside crude tallies presumably made by the imprisoned children. A larger central chamber contained what appeared to be an altar with restraint fixtures, surrounded by drainage channels that forensic analysis confirmed had once contained human blood. Leather-bound liturgical books detailed the purification rituals, combining elements of Orthodox exorcism with invented ceremonies focused on bloodline cleansing, requiring children to renounce not only personal sins, but the supposed moral failings of their ancestors going back generations. Those who survived initial stages were subjected to increasingly severe tests of spiritual fortitude, including prolonged sensory deprivation, extreme temperature exposure, and ritualistic bloodletting intended to physically remove corrupt elements from their bodies. Former staff members still living were located and interviewed, though most claimed ignorance of what occurred in the restricted areas. Janet Wilson, a kitchen assistant at St. Dominic's from 1958 to 1960, recalled being instructed to prepare special fasting meals for children in spiritual retreat, consisting of bread and water delivered to Sister Agnes rather than to the main dining hall. She remembered children returning from these retreats looking gaunt and subdued, some bearing unexplained bruises, others seemingly unable to speak about their experiences. When she had once questioned Sister Agnes about a particularly distressed child, she was sharply reminded that her job was to cook, not to concern herself with spiritual matters beyond her understanding. Most staff, she explained, learned quickly that curiosity about the special program led to immediate dismissal, creating a culture of deliberate blindness that allowed the atrocities to continue unchallenged. Most heartbreaking were the identities of the victims, painstakingly reconstructed from orphanage records and DNA analysis of the remains. Thomas Collins, the first to disappear, had been surrendered to the orphanage by his grandmother, who could no longer care for him after his mother died of tuberculosis. Elizabeth Foster, the final victim, had been a bright child who excelled at mathematics and drawing, remembered by a former classmate as always helping younger children with their lessons. Each child had been selected not for any personal failing, but for accidents of birth, for having parents who were unmarried, imprisoned, mentally ill, or simply poor. Their potential, their dreams, their very lives had been sacrificed to satisfy the twisted theological fantasies of wealthy patrons and complicit clergy who genuinely believed they were performing a sacred duty by purging society of bloodlines they deemed unworthy. The legal consequences unfolded slowly, complicated by the decades that had passed and the deaths of primary perpetrators. Father Michael Collins, now 91 and the last surviving staff member with direct knowledge of the program, was deemed mentally unfit to stand trial due to advanced dementia, though investigators confirmed his handwriting on numerous documents authorizing children for purification. The current Lord Weatherby faced charges of obstruction of justice and evidence tampering related to his recent attempts to conceal family involvement, eventually accepting a plea deal that included substantial financial penalties but no prison time, a resolution that many victims' advocates condemned as grossly inadequate. Several elderly church administrators who had participated in the subsequent cover-up received suspended sentences, their advanced age and expressions of remorse persuading the court toward leniency despite the severity of their complicity. Beyond criminal proceedings, civil lawsuits targeted both the Weatherby Foundation and the Anglican Church, seeking compensation for surviving family members of the victims and funding for ongoing investigation into other potential cases of abuse. The Weatherby family ultimately surrendered nearly 40% of their remaining fortune to settlement funds while maintaining their public position that current family members bore no moral responsibility for the actions of their ancestors. The church, facing potential financial ruin from multiple lawsuits, agreed to a comprehensive settlement that included not only monetary compensation but commitments to institutional reform, transparent record-keeping, and the establishment of permanent memorials at all sites of confirmed abuse. Critics noted that these concessions came only after the evidence became irrefutable and public opinion had turned decisively against both institutions. For the community of Blackmere, the revelations brought a complex mixture of vindication, shame, and collective grief. Elderly residents who had whispered about strange occurrences at St. Dominic's for decades finally saw their suspicions confirmed, though many expressed guilt at not having acted more forcefully on their concerns. Younger generations grappled with the knowledge that such horrors had occurred in their picturesque village, beneath the benevolent facade of church charity and aristocratic patronage. The housing development built on the former orphanage grounds became the focus of community debate, with some residents unable to continue living there after learning what lay beneath their homes, while others argued that abandoning the site would only compound the tragedy by erasing the physical space of remembrance. On the first anniversary of the discoveries, a memorial garden was dedicated on a portion of the former St. Dominic's grounds donated by current homeowners. 12 apple trees were planted, one for each identified victim, surrounding a simple stone monument inscribed with their names and the dates of their short lives. The ceremony, attended by hundreds of local residents and covered by national media, included readings from recovered documents describing the children before their selection for the program, brief glimpses of personalities and potential forever lost to a cruel ideology masquerading as spiritual care. Representatives from both the Weatherby family and the church were notably absent, their public statements expressing respect for the occasion undermined by their private efforts to distance themselves from ongoing fallout. As twilight fell, local school children placed candles around each tree, their small flames illuminating the gathering darkness in silent testimony to lives extinguished but no longer forgotten. The story of St. Dominic's continues to reverberate beyond Blackmere, prompting renewed scrutiny of historical institutional care throughout Britain. Similar investigations have been launched at dozens of former orphanages, reformatories, and church homes, revealing patterns of abuse that suggest the Weatherby case, while extreme, was not entirely unique. Historians and sociologists point to the dangerous convergence of factors that enabled such atrocities: the unquestioned authority of religious institutions, the deference accorded to aristocratic wealth, and the vulnerability of children without familial advocates. Legislative reforms have strengthened oversight of modern child care facilities, mandated preservation of institutional records, and extended statutes of limitation for historical abuse cases. Practical changes that acknowledge the systemic failures that allowed St. Dominic's to operate unchallenged for so long. For Emma Clark, whose discovery in a dusty attic changed the course of so many lives, including her own, the aftermath brought both professional recognition and personal cost. Her doctoral research shifted to focus on documenting and analyzing the St. Dominic's case, resulting in a widely acclaimed thesis that has become required reading in social work and religious studies programs. She continues to advocate for accountability and transparency, frequently consulting with similar investigations across Europe. Yet the weight of what she uncovered remains a heavy burden: the nightmares about children she never met, but whose suffering she has come to know in intimate detail. When asked in a recent interview whether she regrets opening the trunk that day at Weatherby Hall, she replied without hesitation that painful truth must always be preferable to comfortable ignorance, particularly when that ignorance allows injustice to remain unchallenged. The grounds of St. Dominic's Parish Home lie quiet now, the memorial trees growing taller each year, their branches reaching toward a sky that 12 children once gazed upon, perhaps wondering if divine intervention would save them from their ordeal. The Weatherby estate has been sold to a luxury hotel development corporation, its grand rooms where aristocrats once plotted purification, now hosting corporate retreats and wedding receptions for guests, largely unaware of the dark history attached to the family name. Church services continue in Blackmere Village, though attendance has never recovered to pre-scandal levels, the breach of trust too fundamental to be repaired by institutional apologies or reformed policies. And somewhere in the county archives, preserved now for history rather than hidden from it, the meticulously kept records of Lady Victoria Weatherby and Father Blackwood remain as testament to how easily moral certainty can become moral catastrophe when power operates without accountability and faith without compassion. As darkness falls across the memorial garden on quiet evenings, locals sometimes report seeing small, fleeting shadows moving between the trees or hearing what sounds like children's laughter carried on the wind. Most dismiss these accounts as imagination, heightened by knowledge of the site's history, yet some find comfort in the possibility that something of those 12 souls remains, no longer imprisoned in dark chambers of purification, but free at last in the open air above the ground that holds their remains. The bell in the village church tolls each evening at 7 o'clock, 12 deliberate rings added to its normal pattern, ensuring that as time passes and memories fade, as new scandals capture public attention and old atrocities recede into history, the children of St. Dominic's will never again be consigned to silence. Their names are spoken, their stories told, their too brief lives acknowledged as worthy of remembrance by a community and a nation that failed them in life, but is determined, however belatedly, to honor them in death.